No.
Right. All right, you let me know, miss. All right. This hearing is called to order on Wednesday, January 3rd, 2024 at 6:45 p.m. at Brooklyn Community Board 14 office. The purpose of this hearing is to invite public comment on zoning text amendment City of Yes for economic development. On October 30th, 2023, the Department of City Planning referred out the City of Yes Economic Development Citywide Zoning Text Amendment N240010ZRY with the CEQR number 24DCP004Y, beginning the public review process. The proposed zoning text amendment intends to implement changes to the city's zoning resolution to support economic growth and resiliency in New York City. The proposed zoning text amendment would primarily update use definitions and use allowances within existing commercial and manufacturing zoning districts. These changes would clarify what commercial and industrial uses are allowed and define the circumstances under which they are allowed by amending zoning use definitions. The proposed zoning text amendment would also add or modify discretionary actions that could be pursued in the future, including special permits of the Boards of Standards and Appeals, BSA, authorizations and special permits of the City Planning Commission, CPC. Lastly, the proposed zoning text would add new commercial and manufacturing zone districts to the zoning resolution that could be applied to specific geographies in the future via a separate zoning action. No new districts would be mapped by the proposed zoning text amendment. Any proposals that seek discretionary actions created by this proposed zoning text amendment would require environmental review at the time of application. The proposed zoning text amendment would apply to all 59 of the city's community districts. The Department of City Planning is referring this application to affected community boards for 60 days. Comments or recommendations on this application are due by January 8th, 2024. Let's go around the room and introduce ourselves for the record, starting with this gentleman.
Hello, everyone. Steve Cohen, board member.
Glenn Wolin, board member.
Greg Alvarez, board member.
Carl Henry Cesar, board member.
Joel Siegel, board member.
Nina Sabger, board member.
Deborah Valentine, board member.
Yvette Jane, board member. Yes, please, if you would,
Dimitri, just first time participation.
welcome.
Nice.
Martin Brisson, board member.
Melissa Middick, board member.
Corazon Valiente, board member.
Avram Malachowski, representing Councilmember Farrah Lewis.
Musa Hassoun, board member.
Susan Phillip, board member.
William Matar, board member.
Sean Campbell, district manager.
Talisha Sainville, board member. Joanne Brown, board member and chair of community board 14. We have no public comment. We close public comment for this meeting tonight at 6:15 p.m. We have no members of the public wishing to speak. Am I correct? Do you wish to speak this evening? Okay, no public members here to speak at this time. What we'll do is we'll start going through the slides in the absence of the representative from the Department of City Planning and see if we can't get some context. My goal is to focus us on the district. I guess we'll run through each slide and see if we can get some context. I think we're aware of what the purpose is going forward. We're also aware of what so just to highlight, we're still in the public review process, which is going to end soon. Our little talking heads, thank you very much. All right. So the goals, make it easier for businesses. Just gonna go back so we can talk within the goals. Great. Easier to find space and grow. support growing industries and that, you know, this, we should highlight some of these because we'll talk about these: urban agriculture, nightlife, amusement, home-based businesses. Corridor design, micro distribution, new opportunities for businesses, corner stores, something we should talk about. We can go to the next slide. All right, so we'll start with this one. Reactivate storefronts, allow closed storefronts in residential areas to reopen. So we all have the worksheet in front of us. And this would be where we start to have a conversation about reactivating storefronts. I think in, as I said, Talisha, Greg, Sean, and I have been working on a document to kind of, you know, get some comments along, so that when we finish this meeting, we have a consensus amongst this group that we can get a document together very quickly so it can be reviewed for the meeting on Monday. Can I ask you, would you say in your opinion that reactivating storefronts, are they a majority in residential districts or it's a mix? I've seen comments from other boards say that they're mostly in residential districts.
Yeah, maybe they're being specific to their districts as to whether or not it's majority or not. For us, it could be a mix, right? Because, you know, most of our commercial activity are along the main corridors. So maybe it skews a little bit more for us. So maybe if we were to say mix, that might be appropriate.
Okay. So, as I said, in other districts, they tend to be more heavy in residential areas. It's a mix in our district. Does anybody have any thoughts about the reactivation of storefronts? So if you remember, usually a storefront, if it's non-conforming, right? If it was sort of grandfathered in that space and then it closed down, you had 2 years to put another business in. And because of COVID, those 2 years elapsed for many of those properties.
That was the question, is what was the problem with reactivating them? Which you just stated, it was a 2-year, basically it's a 2-year rule, so they're looking at it, giving it more time, I assume.
Yeah, more time.
The presumption being the property owner didn't comply with the changes to make it compliant.
It was a non-conforming space to begin with, and it was allowed to stay, you know, active because it had been there and it had been active, but many businesses closed during COVID. And, you know, a lot of this is driven by reactivating spaces that are non-conforming. So as we can realize that perhaps, these spaces weren't leased or couldn't be leased, they couldn't find tenants. So they remain basically ineligible if this zoning text amendment doesn't pass for this.
Somebody dies and it's a probate and you can't do anything for a while.
That too. Yes,
Do we know how many of these storefronts are in our community?
I don't have a count. I think for this one, my thoughts were that if they do exist in a residential area, that the use group, that the ones that exist in residential areas should maybe be confined. A use group would be like, you know, a community facilities. What did I put here? So limited to use group 3, community facilities without sleeping accommodations, right? And usually community facilities are like dental offices, doctors' offices, daycares, professional offices, could be childcare education. I threw in, it would be great to have a professional office for an elected official in one of these residential corner commercial professional spaces. So my personal opinion was that I wasn't opposed to it. It was just more confining what the use group could be, as opposed to having maybe a store that, you know, which we're seeing right now because of business trends, could be a smoke shop or something. That's why thinking that it would stay as a community facility.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Question on that. Wouldn't it be simpler just to expand home use groups under current zoning instead of doing a zoning text amendment? So right now, like, I think an acceptable home use group is childcare, or I know, like, mental health care psychologists, can hang a plaque and, so why would you just expand those acceptable use groups to add, instead of changing zoning?
I think they want to be more expansive here. Say there was a restaurant on the corner that had been there forever and it went out during COVID, for instance, and to give that opportunity for that to go back.
Mhm.
Something that maybe goes beyond those use groups where, a lot of times in residential areas, they're permitted anyway. But, allows for that expansion of it. So you kind of have to have that, at least to be aware of it, you'd have to have that institutional knowledge to know, oh yeah, that restaurant was there and that's what's, gonna be able to go back there. And, I think the proposal is here, well, we're just gonna let them do it, without really letting anybody know.
Without defining, right now, I don't see any definitions for any particular use group. So long as if the use group says C1, C2, C3, C4, or R1, if it has all of the zoning districts, then you can put anything in that table in that space. So, yeah.
Well, when you're talking about non-conforming, it sounds like this is very good for potential businesses. But if it's non-conforming in a residential neighborhood, do the neighbors necessarily want to see another business there, the residential neighborhood? And I don't see any, from what I've read of this, any opportunities to really let the neighbors have a say and maybe shut it down, as opposed to just blanket for 3 or 4 years.
Well, right, there's two things going on right now. I mean, the space is now, if it's been over 2 years, it's just gonna go away if this isn't approved. That might be good in some areas, it might be bad in some areas, you know what I mean? It just really depends on what was there. If it was a beloved neighborhood bistro, then, but yeah, we are, and the second part is they are not allowing, this is gonna be as of right, they are not allowing any public input.
And David just here.
How are you? We're pretending we're you.
Sorry, I'm late.
Probably
It
some.
was all good and ready to go. It's a lot. I didn't know. Second.
Yeah, that's fine, okay.
So you're just gonna come in and jump right in.
Hey, hit the ground running. I already kept y'all waiting, so it's the least I could do. Okay, so, I know that we had a presentation on this a couple months ago, so I'm gonna kind of re-up this right now. And, is this the first one?
No, this is what we're starting now.
Oh, you went through some of the
Mhm.
initial stuff. Okay, so the timeline, we all kind of have an understanding. So there will be a public hearing at the end of the month. The public hearing will not be the vote. So the hearing, anyone is free to attend. It is public. You can voice your concerns separate from what we'll discuss here, or in addition to what we'll discuss here, in addition to what CB14 eventually decides to kind of state. But the vote will not be held. So even if you as an individual or as a separate group or as a community board sends in written correspondence after the public hearing, as long as it's before the end of the month of January, it will be considered. So you could probably send it afterwards, but we are 110% sure that by the end of January, if something is submitted, that will be considered by the CPC. Yeah.
So, okay, so we were talking about this reactive storefronts and, if they there's been no active business there. So my question is, I guess on a very practical level, if a store or business is no longer allowed to occupy that space, what happens to that space? I mean, if you've ever gone through a place where stores have been shuttered down, it's really depressing. So on a very practical level, what then happens with that space? If they're no longer, is somebody gonna take responsibility for dismantling the physical whatever and creating something else?
So I'm glad you brought that up. That's exactly the purpose of this proposal. And actually, if we move forward a couple of slides, I have applicability maps of where that would actually, perhaps be permitted. But basically, what the rule is now is in certain residential districts, old commercial spaces, many of which are grandfathered in, right? They're pre-1961. right? Many of those commercial spaces went vacant, right? Business went out, fine. In certain areas, in certain residential districts, you can refill that space with another commercial use, even though it's technically in a residential district. You're allowed to do that. In certain districts, you can only do that within 2 years of the prior business closing down. So in those districts right now, where you can only do it within 2 years, 2 years is really not a lot of time for those of you who are business people, you know, a lot of things can happen, right? So oftentimes what happens is other folks will try to come in and say, oh, we want to open, you know, a small business, that usually small storefronts, right? We want to open a small business or something. And the city says, sorry, you can't do that. A lot of these spaces were built for commercial use. So there's really difficult to convert them to a different kind of use, right? To a residential use, often if they're residential above. And so we're kind of looking at 1961 ZR and saying, well, just as you said, a lot of those uses, they're vacant, they're blighted, they don't add to a vibrant street frontage. And that's what we want to kind of remove that limitation. And so it's allowed in certain residential districts now. We said, why not allow them in all residential districts? That's our proposal.
No time frame at all.
Correct. Yes.
I just wanted to clarify, so there's 2 votes that are happening. I know that Chair Brown was mentioning a vote tomorrow, or that's separate, or?
No, yeah, so the process is that community boards weigh in until January, community boards weigh in, the borough president's office, the borough board weighs in, then it goes to CPC, right? So those are the votes. So tomorrow is borough board, public hearing. And probably a vote, voting on it.
So 2 questions. So David, thank you. So the first question is, do you yet know the date when the public hearing will happen on the City of Yes, the economic opportunity?
24th.
Okay, so it's happening on the 24th?
Correct.
What time?
Need to get to public hearings are 10 a.m.
Okay, gotcha. And it'd be at City Hall?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, so these hearings will be held at 120 Broadway,
Okay.
the Equitable Building in the Financial District.
Okay,
And
gotcha.
so in the basement of that building is the CPC hearing.
Okay, so thank you for that. And then the second thing too is, I think when you had made presentation on this earlier, one of the questions that came up with this storefront proposal was, I guess like residential or neighbor-like input. And so I guess the question is like what the city's proposing where that 2-year window would no longer apply. I thought there was a question from a community board member at that time about, oh, what does that mean for like community input, right? Like, is there a process in this proposal where the community would be notified, like, hey, somebody's thinking of putting this in, or it's like, if somebody wants to come in and put in their business,
That's it.
That's
That's it, right.
For this specific proposal, reactivation is as of right. There are other proposals that are intended to help small businesses in that small areas where there will be either a BSA permit, in which there is more community input, that's discretionary.
yes.
Or there may be a special permit, but for reactivation specifically, that would be as of right.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yes.
And just to be clear on the reactivation of the storefront, if a site gets reactivated, it's still subject to all the normal, I guess, like business operation regs. So for example, if it's within, I don't know, whatever, 500 feet of a school, you know, it's still, you can't open up like a smoke shop there or whatever.
Well, you have to look at the use groups. So the use group for reactivation is quite large.
Yes, but if I understand your question correctly or your comment correctly, I think you may be speaking of things outside of the realm of the zoning resolution. Is that your question? Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought that up because that covers a lot of the proposals here today. Is when you look at it kind of in a vacuum of the ZR, it seems, well, you're allowing all these things. And yet what we've often found from 1961 to today and so forth is that DCP is not the best at regulating certain things, right? And so business regulations would still apply, right? Noise regulations, health and safety protocol for different businesses, those all still apply. We've gotten a lot of questions about cannabis, for instance.
It's not in the zoning text amendment at all.
Right, and that's because we are really not good at regulating
But
that.
you have tobacco in there as a use group.
Pardon?
You have tobacco manufacturing, tobacco in there. So, I mean, again, this is for a larger discussion, but what I'm saying is that I don't think that this zoning text amendment, that you need to define that as a nice code.
Define what as a what? Sorry.
Cannabis dispensaries, cannabis production, cannabis laboratories, cannabis distribution, right? None of, all of those things are been identified for other NICE codes, other business codes, like
Mhm.
tobacco manufacturing. This
It's
zoning
not in
text
here,
amendment is not,
correct.
and one of the recommendations I think that we should make is that it be included.
You're free to make that recommendation,
Right.
that's fine. I think the way that we look at it is that state regulation of marijuana is more trustworthy and more whole encompassing, in other words, right? They have the resources and the ability and the research, quite frankly, to look at a lot of those uses, determine where they're appropriate, where they're not, and more specifically, the detailed like engineering of those spaces, right? How to make sure that any of those spaces that whether they're growing cannabis or selling it, those are regulated at the state level, right?
Yeah,
And so you're welcome to make that recommendation. That's
Yeah.
very fair. That's kind of what we found in our.
I mean, we'll talk about this later, but it's a hole that we noticed, you know, in. Yeah,
So what's the reason why they create this 2 years rule before? So it should be reason, and what happened in the past if 2 years is finished, what's happened before? We have a story about this?
This
Did
is one of-
they convert with something, or it's just disappear, or what's happened before?
What happened, you mean, before 1961 when this rule was implemented or?
Yes, yes. So for example, they created this rule for some reason, and it probably was a good idea. And do you have a track, or if it's expired 2 years, what happened with these stores?
Before the zoning resolution, my understanding is there wasn't a lot of, I mean, we didn't even have the R districts or C districts as we know them today to begin with. So the activation rule was kind of moot because the activation rule is based upon the residential districts existing. In 1961, we created the residential districts, and so storefronts that opened prior to that, because we didn't really have the zoning and the detailed zoning resolution,
Mhm.
businesses would close, businesses would open. It was a far less regulated environment overall.
So one second, so we're gonna take Sean's question and then we're gonna let him do the presentation because we're never gonna get through what we need to do and this. So we'll get the presentation, we'll be more informed and then we'll have a conversation using this worksheet. Okay, go ahead, Sean.
Okay, I could also wait because this will be appropriate for so many aspects of this.
Okay, so let's let you continue the presentation because you sort of came in and we were all activated having a conversation. So let's have the presentation. Get-
Activated on reactivated.
And again, I apologize to the bottom of my heart for making you wait. It was not the intention, that's to be sure. So we talked about reactivating storefronts. I'll go over some of these a little bit more quickly, but of course, at the end, I think if that's the way you want to organize it, we can circle back to any of these, right? So reactivating storefronts, we talked about simplifying district types, right? So we can talk about this in future slides. I also have applicability maps of showing where this happens. In many districts, including CB14, although to a slightly lesser extent, there's C1 overlays and C2 overlays, right? Many of you may live in some of these buildings that are residential districts. That's the underlying zoning district, but then there's a commercial overlay, right? Those are these neighborhood serving retail strips, right? That we know about, you know? Typically it's retail with a couple stories of residential above, right? C1 overlays allow certain types of uses and C2 overlays allow certain types of uses, but a little bit more. However, to the naked eye, when you're walking down the street, you really can't tell the difference between one or the other, right? And so one example that we always, find that we think is a bit antiquated is, for instance, in C1 districts, you can have bike sales. And in C2 districts, you can have bike sales and bike repair. But in C1, you can't repair a bike, right? That's kind of the thing that we're looking at. So what we're trying to do is equalize the C1 and C2 overlays, because what we found throughout the city is the C2 districts don't really allow anything that's majorly nuisance producing. And often we can't even tell the difference from one side of the street to the other. So we're just going to equalize those and allow a little bit more opportunity for small businesses, right? Number 3 is small scale production, right? So clean manufacturing businesses. I know, people may hear manufacturing and think, smokestacks, right? At least that's what I thought when I first read this proposal as well. But that's really not what we're trying to do. There's just a lot of different changes in technology and a different economy route. And so we're kind of like stuck in the 60s, you know, based on how we think about maker businesses, right? You think of folks who maybe make jewelry, you know, on their own, or people who have, you know, small 3D printers or something like that. Apparel design, coffee roasters, sometimes pottery studios, things like that. Those today are not permitted thanks to some of our antiquated rules in commercial districts. And so we're trying to allow those in some of our commercial overlays and more of our commercial districts, right? Number 4, this is something else that we find to be a bit antiquated based on how manufacturing and industrial, you know, uses work in the city. There's a lot of big loading dock requirements anytime that you want to add an industrial use or a maker space, kind of what I was just talking about in 3. However, many of the things that we're producing today and in a lot of our buildings, they don't actually need these huge trucks or beds to distribute. You know, they're small things. And so when we have requirements for loading docks, it makes a lot of businesses either unfeasible because you have to make major changes to a building that are just too expensive. Or if you do make those changes, the loading docks add to like this kind of streetscape, often in commercial districts. And we don't really think that that's always necessary. You know, we find that the uses that need those kind of big loading beds, they'll usually add them. And we'll still maintain those requirements in manufacturing, but not always in some of our commercial districts, right? Some of our older commercial buildings, we want to make them, you know, feasible to change over time to accommodate the growing economy. All right, number 5, we want to allow commercial on upper floors, right? So we've seen this already in several cities. We see it in New York City, frankly, quite a bit. It's actually permitted in a lot of our districts already, particularly in MX districts, right, where we have this mix of manufacturing and residential or light manufacturing, right? So without being able to use that for upper floors, it makes it difficult to adapt buildings over time, right? There are serious rules and regulations that are still going to be maintained here, right? And so I know there's been concern from several other community boards and members that I've spoken to about having a residential building just becoming a full office building or a full commercial building. That's not the case, and that's not what we're intending because of some of these feasibility rules that will be in there. And I can go into a little bit more detail, but in short, you'll need to have separate entrances for the commercial and the residential. You'll need to have separation between commercial and residential when the commercial is a certain use that may produce a nuisance. And again, can go into more detail of that, but that's kind of the overlay of it. And number 6, modernizing the use terms, right? So you brought up the NACS, right? So we have these use groups today that were started in 1961. There's 18 of them. They're not clear, to say the very least. And so what we want to do is clarify those for business owners who want to open a business. They try to look in our ZR. They say, I have no idea where I'm allowed to go. You know, I don't even know what I'm allowed to do. Not to mention that a lot of the uses defined in the zoning resolution today are things that may have been prevalent in 1961, but don't really reflect the way today's economy actually works. For instance, typewriter repair, that's in the ZR. Cell phone, not in the ZR. You know, that's the kind of thing that we just want to make updates to. Right, so that's all under goal 1, just making it easier for businesses to find space. So, oh, hi. All right, so growing industries, right? So indoor agricultural facilities, right? So this is something else that we really may not have been comfortable with decades ago because we didn't really have the technologies that we have today, right? Things like vertical farming, things that are actually really successful and that can actually be developed without providing nuisances to other uses in a building or to the rest of the neighborhood. We want to allow those within C districts. It also helps with making sure that food is fresher and can be grown a little bit closer to folks that are consuming it. All right. Proposal 8. So this is life sciences. So a lot of these are heavily regulated now, and they are very difficult to locate near the places that actually want to use the results of some of these experiments and some of these, you know, details, right, near hospitals and universities, right? So there are very outdated rules about where those are permitted, right? So you want to expand with a special permit, can be used so labs can be able to locate closer to research centers, closer to hospitals, closer to laboratories, right? So that's something that we're looking at. Number 9, nightlife, right? So a lot of nightlife is actually already permitted, which is, sometimes difficult to remember because a lot of times it may not be taken advantage of. So for instance, you can already have live music in basically any commercial overlay. Many restaurants and bars choose not to have it, that's fine. But for some of those places, you can have live music, but you're not allowed to dance, right? So the second I do this, I'm in violation of the zoning resolution. We think within reason and in certain districts, we want to be able to actually permit some of that because we've heard from many businesses saying, I'd like to have a small area for dancing or something, or I'd like to have a ticketed event, a comedy show, an open mic night, something like that. So in some of our districts, and again, I can go into more detail about the specifics of that a little bit later. I've got slides on that. We want to kind of make that a little bit easier while still maintaining regulations to ensure that nuisances are kept confined within that space itself. And we think we've found a good way to do so.
I have to tell you something. My understanding is all those regulations were thrown out. In fact, the gentleman, the lawyer that fought that died within the past couple of weeks. I forget his last name, had a French. My understanding was the cabaret law was thrown out, and he also fought the dancing limitations. And my concern about this is you're going to actually be creating more regulations where there aren't any now. So I don't want to stop your momentum.
Yeah,
Understood.
let's continue on.
I'll return to that later. Yeah, that is a good point. 10, amusements, right? Again, a little bit of antiquation, right? There's a lot of 1961 about amusements as we understand them as old-fashioned arcades that you may find in Coney Island or things like that. They don't really reflect what a lot of amusements are today, right? We have VR parks and things like that, and where you really can't open those, right, in a lot of our district. And so we want to make that a little bit easier to kind of permit in certain areas and with size limitations, right? In overlays, you can only have them in small areas and you can only have them indoors, things like that. In bigger commercial districts, there are different regulations that we are proposing. And finally, home occupations. Home occupations is something that we've all engaged in at some point over the last 4 or 5 years, I would imagine. We already have home occupations that are permitted. What we're doing is kind of loosening the rules ever so slightly because a lot of the regulations about what can be a home occupation right now is from 1961. You can't have an interior decorator, for instance, but you can give drum lessons. Which one's louder? Something like that. And changing the size in which you can actually have it, right? Right now, you can only use about 25% of your home, or however large your home may be. We want to increase that to about 49%. Make sure it's still a residence primarily, but people can work from home and actually do so efficiently without breaking the ZR every time they, work from their bed as opposed to the desk, So we can move on to the next slide. So sorry.
Trisha, next slide.
We have the next slide, please.
Thanks.
All right, number 3. So this is about making our neighborhoods more vibrant. Better ground floor designs. I know there were a lot of questions about this last time we were around. This is something we're really excited about because there's really unclear and not really consistent regulations right now about our urban design, about our vibrant, making sure our streets are vibrant. So we're going to have a tiering system of where your business is located, kind of depending on the vibrancy of the street as it exists, the amount of active ground floors, and how your parking can be, right? Where your loading can be, things like that. Not only will we think that this will help add to more vibrant storefronts and more vibrant commercial streets, but we also think it can help reduce incidents of pedestrians and vehicular traffic, by reducing the in and out a little bit. Number 13, I know there were questions about auto repair as well. This is actually one of those situations where, if anything, we're actually adding a little bit of regulation. So right now, there's a heavy auto repair. Those are allowed in C8 districts and in M districts, manufacturing districts. Makes sense, right? The manufacturing districts are where you can get your car repaired, drive it there, get it towed there, whatever. However, there are exceptions today in the 1961 zoning resolution where instead of having your whole car repaired, there are exceptions that are a little bit difficult to understand. I was reading through it today and I was confused. You can maybe get your windshield replaced or something, or you can have, a quick upholstery change inside your car or something like that. Those are permitted in certain commercial districts as of right today. We don't think that that's necessarily appropriate, and because a lot of these places have it's because it's so difficult to understand, they'll open one of those small, repair things where you could drive in real quick, windshield crack replaced, whatever, and then drive out. These businesses don't really know what they are, and because it's as of right, there's a little bit less oversight. And so what ends up happening is there's a lot of cars that are parked on the sidewalk, right? They'll do a little bit larger repair outside. So what we're gonna do is make it a little bit more clear of your heavy automotive repair, and those will remain in manufacturing districts and C8 districts only, right? Which is kind of where they're designed, the districts are designed for those uses. And then there's gonna be light repair, which covers some of those quicker repair items, right? Windshields, lubricants, upholstery, I keep going back to those as good examples. And those will require a BSA special permit. Right, so we're actually, if anything, adding a little bit more regulation. The special permit not only allows a little bit more community input, actually quite a bit of community input, and we have findings proposed in the zoning resolution that the BSA would need to find to actually move this forward. And also, the BSA reviews site plans, right? They actually get to review the site plans more specifically and look at the potential harms, right? So do you actually have reservoir room for these cars you're planning to bring in? Can we make the findings that you're not actually going to interfere with things? And so this kind of strays, I guess, from the overall, intent, but we're trying to loosen the regulations a little bit. We're actually adding a little bit more here. So it's about clarity and oversight, right, for these uses. Number 14 is micro distribution. So what we see here is what we see and what I'm sure a lot of you have seen in a lot of locations around the city, which is even a small business, right? If you look back to our previous proposal of small maker spaces or bakeries or things like that, who want to ship some small items or deliver some small items, or even allow some items to be picked up by somebody walking on foot in the neighborhood or something, they can't do that now. You know who can do that? The US Postal Service. So what we want to allow is what we allow for the US Postal Service for a private business, right? So allow some small spaces where if I'm a local business, I can have, a location maybe nearby if a private business opens up where I can store some of my items. And then instead of having these big UPS trucks deliver what are very likely small parcels, we'll have maybe a bike courier come by, right? Or even somebody walking and delivery on foot, right? It's the model of kind of a USPS where we'll have, the main city post office distributing to the smaller areas and smaller neighborhoods. And this removes, we think, a lot of the trucks from the street. It also helps with, some circulation. We spoke about this a couple weeks ago as well. And next slide, please. Finally, goal 4. And so this is allowing local businesses to open with some new opportunities, right? So campus commercials, campuses, when you see them, they tend to be NYCHA campuses, New York City Housing Authority campuses. And we want to enable some makerspace, allow a little bit of retail on these campuses where currently they may not be allowed and almost certainly are not permitted, right? And so we'll have a little bit more detail and regulation on where those are permitted. But they're zoned as residential districts, these campuses. There's almost none if I'm not.
We don't have
mistaken.
any in the district.
Yeah, you don't have any in the district. Okay. So we can move on to corner stores. So this kind of goes back to what we were speaking about in the beginning with reactivating vacancies. A lot of those old commercial uses are located in residential districts. They couldn't open today, but they existed, way before the zoning revolution. It's often a bodega and a corner store or something like that. There are certain neighborhoods in the city, and we've heard about them. Some are in Staten Island, some are here, some are elsewhere, where they said, it would be really nice to have a corner store, nearby. The closest commercial overlay is 5, 6, 7 blocks away. It's difficult to get to. We'd really like to have that. And so we at DCP, we said, okay, well, how can we allow that without rezoning to commercial, which would allow way more commercial uses than what's intended, right? What's intended is just, people want a small commercial store. And so what we said is, okay, let's leave the residential districts as they are and create a process with a very high bar for a small business to open, right? With size limits as well. For that, the applicant would need to go through an environmental review, probably hire an environmental consultant, which is kind of pricey, and they would need to get a BSA special permit. And with that BSA special permit, they would need to make findings. You would have a significant role, right, in that BSA special permit. So we aren't sure this would actually be taken advantage of all the time because it really requires a situation in which a significant portion of the community is really on board with it. The applicant kind of is willing to put that money forward because they think that they'll be successful with it. But nonetheless, we wanted to create that opportunity. And the alternative to that is doing rezonings to commercial districts or commercial overlays where they may not actually be appropriate. It's just kind of a one-off, you know? Coming down to the last two, adapting spaces for industry. A lot of film studios, actually, it's interesting. We've had some difficulty expanding and you know, modifying a little bit of their space. So we want to kind of simplify some of those rules. So they struggle to build sound stages, for instance. There was yard requirements, setback requirements, and things like that. And so we want to clarify some of these zoning rules and make it a little bit easier for some of those larger businesses. And finally, number 18. So these are new law-style zoning districts. So for those of you who know the ZR very well, you know we've got basically 3 manufacturing districts, M1, M2, M3, right? M1s you find, you know, very near residential districts or even mixed in with them in the case of MX, where those are non-nuisance producing usually, right? And they're highly regulated. M3s on the other side of the spectrum, those are the heavy industry places, right? Those sometimes have the smokestacks and those are heavily regulated as well. We want to keep those further away. And then we've got the M2s, which are kind of a little bit of a bridge between. The rules are very rigid for each. And so there are a lot of businesses where, you know, the zoning as it exists doesn't exactly make sense because of the FARs. And so there's been calls from City Hall, from a lot of our council members and from a lot of our neighborhoods, a lot of our community boards who have a high concentration of M districts to say, let's have different options, right? And actually be able to specify on a neighborhood scale what makes sense here instead of just having to pick from this very limited menu of options. I want to note, however, none of these M districts are actually going to be put in the zoning map if ZEO is passed. This will simply expand the menu, right, of options and items that could be chosen, right? They're just adding different M districts that have different regulations. So even if ZEO is passed and somebody wants to utilize one of those new districts, they would still need to go through the full rezoning process, which of course is a ULURP action, right? All we're doing is expanding kind of the menu. So that's the summary. We can go to the next slide. I can just kind of put it together. So I can run through these rather quickly. These are some of the applicability maps. I do assume, you know, that's something that would be interesting. So here's the overlay. Y'all know your district pretty well, but just kind of an overview of kind of what we've seen. So you're actually at 104% of your pre-COVID jobs. So economic, you know, growth is going all right here. We want to make sure that that can continue. A lot of institutional jobs and local services as well. And you can kind of see some of the locations given, you know, where they're located shouldn't be surprising.
That's for sure.
It's over commercial service.
That answers your earlier question about storefronts.
Oh, what's this? Oh, yeah.
24.
Vacant storefronts. Yeah, so about 11%, which is about 12% in BK and New York City, higher than we'd like, you know, and you can see some of those locations that are not filled in. So there's quite a few vacancies. All right. Let's go to the next slide, please. Great. All right, so here's an overview. There are certain proposals that are going to be applicable citywide. They're not district specific, right? Some of them, they make sense, right? The loading dock rules refer basically to everywhere, although those are really mostly going to be utilized in the commercial district. Simplifying the use terms makes sense, that just the terminology, it doesn't matter what district you're in, so that'll be everywhere. The waiver process for BSA and CPC, that is the one where I was speaking about the film studios. But there's other kind of processes that are a little bit confusing that we want to simplify. And then, of course, the M districts, they must be mapped in future rezonings, but technically they could be mapped anywhere. They won't be mapped in many of these places, but technically, in theory, they could be. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we can go district by district. So C1 districts, remember earlier I was saying we want to clarify and kind of reduce that incongruency between the C1 overlays and the C2s. You actually don't have a ton of C1s. Most of your commercial overlays are C2s already, but you can see some of the C1s right here on 18 and over here as well, and everything else is C2. So here are the proposals that would apply in C1s, right? So again, proposal number 2, allowing the same uses as C2, clean production businesses. These are basically be the same as the C2s because we're trying to equalize those without having to rezone everything.
The shelter.
So let's go to the next slide, please. Here we go, the C2 overlays. So this is much more prevalent, should not be surprising to those of you who live in the district, seeing kind of where the commercial activity is. And the list of proposals that are applicable, as it would make sense, are essentially about equal, right? So let's move on. C4 districts, you have a couple of those here, and those are not overlays, right? C4 districts are commercial districts, which means that they are commercial primarily. You can have residential in them, but you're also allowed to have an office building or a full commercial building. And so there's some things that are there, right? You actually don't have any C5 or C6 districts, but there is a proposal that kind of equalizes some of those. And so, you know, that's there. Allowing clean production, you know, on the ground floor. And then, you know, modernizing the loading dock rules, commercial uses at the same level as residences or above, which is something that kind of we already see in a lot of our C districts, quite frankly. Simplifying the use terms, obviously, indoor agriculture, right? And the enclosure rules, kind of modifying those as we see fit and as we think makes a lot of sense. 9 is that nightlife, eating and drinking establishments that would allow cover charges or specific show times, right? A restaurant or a bar can actually say, hey, we're going to have this person on at this time, or we're going to charge tickets. That would be allowed in C4 and C5 and C6 districts. Indoor amusement or recreation facilities, these would actually be allowed without size limitations here. There would be size limitations in the C1 and C2 overlays, but in the C4 districts, we didn't find that to be appropriate because these are the districts that are kind of designed for that type of destination. The ground floor street design, right? The urban design that's applicable here, certainly. And light motor vehicle repair and maintenance shops, those will be allowed via BSA special permit, as I've said previously. And micro distribution facilities, right? So they'll be allowed up to 5,000 square feet in the ground floor and up to 10,000 square feet above the ground floor. All right, next slide. And actually, you don't have any C5s or C6s, but these are the same thing. So we can go to the next slide. Again, no C6s in CB14. What you do have, oops, went a little bit too fast. What we do have is some residential districts.
A little bit.
Just a little bit. So again, reactivating vacant storefronts, that'll be applicable here. Kind of the first thing that we were talking about as he came in. Updating our rules for home occupations. Happy to go into detail there. Allow a new zoning tool for night shift campuses, which you don't have any in your district, but nonetheless, that is going to be something that we're proposing. And allowing new corner stores in residential districts, the one I was just speaking about a few minutes ago with a BSA special permit. All right, and let's go one more. M districts, you have a couple, not a ton, but we can see what we have here. We're going to, again, modernize the loading dock rules. A lot of industrial businesses today really don't require all those huge loading docks and 18-wheelers. We don't think that's really necessary in a lot of places. And where it is necessary, we'll make sure that those are added in. Simplifying the use terms, that's across the board. Making the waiver process for BSA and CPC easier. A lot of the film studios is what added onto that, but we're looking at other items of ways to make it clearer to applicants what they actually need to go through. And then finally, the new M districts, right? We only have 3 right now, M1, M2, M3. We're going to add a couple of different options as different neighborhoods have different, needs and different requirements for the M districts. But again, none will be actually zoned anywhere here as a result of this action if the ZEO is approved. It'll just expand the menu. And finally, special purpose districts. So Special Ocean Parkway District just cuts into CB14 on that lead coming out to the west. And so we're going to align the ground floor use rules, because sometimes what we found is the special districts aren't always consistent with some of the underlying rules. It makes it a little bit confusing. And so we're looking at each special district kind of as its own, special child and see what's necessary and making sure that they're aligned and simplified. Again, number 6 is across the board, simplifying the use terms. And number 12, enhancing the corridor design guidelines. That's something else. A lot of districts, including Special Ocean Parkway, has specific rules and regulations about urban design in different parts of Special Ocean Parkway District as well. And so we've done a deep dive into SOPD and we're gonna make sure that those corridor design rules do align and make sense with what we are proposing citywide for number 12, right? Which is kind of making those design rules consistent. Sometimes those regulations in a certain special district require a little bit more regulation based on, specificity. Sometimes we want to make them aligned. And so what we're doing is kind of looking at each district in itself, and we want to make sure that there's not significant contradictions that don't really make sense or serve a purpose there. All right, next slide, please. And so these are ones that I added a few that we can go into if you'd like, but I think that covers the proposals at a very high level. So I'll defer to the board here on how you'd like to approach. I have a couple of more, slides that have this applicability that kind of show where reactivation can be allowed. So for instance, in the gray right now, this is where you can already reactivate a storefront regardless of how long it's been closed. And in the green is where currently you're not allowed to reactivate a storefront if it's been closed 2 or more years. We said we couldn't find a lot of detail about why that's the case. So we're going to propose expansion in that green area. And next slide, please.
So it looks like a lot of residential.
Yeah. And proposal number 12, this is the streetscape design. I know that there were a lot of questions about the specificity. I can go into more detail about this if you'd like, but very high level. First of all, the very large commercial spaces, a lot of those strip malls and places like those are exempt because those are high auto uses, as are lots that are directly adjacent to like highway off ramps, right? That's often that serve different purposes. And then we have different tiers, right? Oh, that's what you see at the bottom. Within 1,000 feet of a highway entrance or a large shopping center far from transit. In tier A, so these are in your commercial overlays and in your commercial districts. There's going to be regulations on where your parking can be located, where you can have drive-throughs and where you can't, and also blank walls, right? We want to make sure that in a lot of those vibrant commercial districts, there's either a lot of visibility, right? So you can see what's going on inside. And in the case where there must be a blank wall, we're going to have some requirements where you actually design it, make it look a little bit nicer. Tier B, so these are going to be streets, commercial overlays that are within the transit zone. These have even higher rules because these are within transit zones. These are usually more active that we found, right? And so they include all the tier A rules, plus they're going to have rules regulating which uses are actually permitted on the ground floor. Right, and so we're gonna say no residences at the ground floor, right? We want to make these active uses. There's gonna be transparency requirements. There's gonna be requirements for where you can add curb cuts. If we find that you can add your parking curb cut on another street that maybe satisfies it, you can't have a million curb cuts that not only break up the street, but also add to a lot of dangerous situations between pedestrians and vehicles. And then tier C. These are going to be special purpose districts in some other geographies, right? So these are specific areas that we find it to be appropriate. You're going to have all the tier A rules, all the tier B rules, and then there's going to be a more robust list of building elements that are actually required in certain cases or prohibited in others, right? So that's, again, the very high level. All right, next slide, please. And this basically summarizes what went over in the beginning. So, we are here, right? So the public hearing is going to be January 24th at 120 Broadway. The commission vote will likely be held in February, and then there will be a city council vote in the spring after they've had time to review past the city planning commission, assuming it does get approved by the city planning commission. Right, so that's the overall summary. At this point, I'll leave it to the board how you'd like to proceed.
Okay. So we were gonna go through the worksheet and have a discussion. It is currently 7:40. I would like to get through this by 8:30. Let's, and you're hanging out for a little bit, right?
If you'd like me to, I'm happy to be
Because I
here.
think
Yeah.
whatever questions we have, but
Yeah.
let's be judicious with the questions too. So we talked about the reactivation of storefronts. We saw a map of what that looked like. Any further comments about that? Again, there was a matter of, it's now, as of right, there won't be public comments on those storefronts. So is there a concern amongst board members as to what are appropriate uses for those reactivated storefronts, that it's particularly in residential areas? Yes.
Just a question on the map. You showed one of the places that doesn't have the reactivation of storefronts available to it without the zoning text amendment. It's in the southeast corner of our district, which you haven't in a couple of presentations identified as a special permit district. But we hear BSA applications on it all the time as a special permit district. So I'm wondering why that isn't considered in this zoning text amendment.
A special permit, you mean a
Enlargement of houses.
Yeah, that's not a district itself, right? So there are regulations. I wish the ZR was a little bit more simple about this, but of course we can't make anything easy. There are regulations for the home enlargements where the BSA has the opportunity for that. It's unrelated to this proposal really as a whole. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the reactivation necessarily of uses, because that would not depend on that area, which is designated kind of in the code. But it's not designated as a different district. It's just a part of the district that says in CB14 between this street, this street, this street, and this street, you could do it. That's unrelated.
Okay.
And it's not its own district, which is why it wasn't shown on the map. It's just kind of laid out in the code as in this area, you can apply for this special district, these home enlargements.
Okay. So back to the question, you said yes. I heard you say yes very quietly. So what's your thoughts?
I agree with what you said earlier, is that there should be a request to limit the use group that can have, that can reactivate the storefronts. And I also had a quick question, what I think is a quick question. In terms of commercial overlays, like C1 and C2 are usually overlaid. Commercial.
There always are, yeah.
Yeah. And when you talk about sort of I forget the word that you used, but the sort of defining C1 and C2, are you talking about consolidated?
Yes,
C1 and C2?
That's number 2.
Okay, okay.
Okay.
But I just want to say
yeah.
on the reactivation of the storefronts, I agree. It should be use groups, and maybe there can be some other kind of provision or modification that we can request that sort of has a little bit more oversight to.
Like like a BSA application of the.
Yeah, maybe
So
something like that.
Opportunity for community input.
Yeah,
To
exactly.
reactivate.
Exactly. Yeah.
I concur with that. I only support this if there's some mechanism for the communities to have a say.
Right, I think that fulfills both the ability for the space to be used, to be utilized by the community, for there to be community input, and we get past this moratorium on 2 years. I can take one last question, and then we need to make a decision about this and move on, because we got 16 of them.
Yep. So for the use groups, I just want to make sure I understand the concern. It's that if a storefront has not been active and missed the 2-year mark, the concern here is that if that location is, I don't know the right word, but authorized, let's say 16 types of businesses, the idea is that you're concerned that reactivating them without community input means certain types of businesses might open up
Correct.
without the neighborhood saying enough
Correct.
for competition.
And the first approach was to limit it to a certain use group, which was community facilities, use group 3 without sleeping accommodation.
Right.
But, and we can make both requests. We can say, and, or, if use group 3 is not BSA, then BSA review.
I kind of like, just to throw in my 2 cents, I kind of like the idea of maybe even limiting the number of use groups rather than adding a BSA permit process, just from my 2 cents.
I will add, there are regulations in the ZR as they exist today, right? For those districts where it is permitted. even past 2 years, and even where you're trying to reactivate within 2 years. So there are regulations on the type of businesses that can be there. Often what we found as well is it's difficult to rejigger some of these smaller spaces to allow a higher nuisance use. So that was our, and again, you can propose what you'd like to propose, that's all fair. But that's kind of our background and our thinking of allowing that by right. There are still regulations, and I can give that information back to you in the future when I get it to the office, specifically which uses.
I looked at them and it's all uses. So that's why I went through all the, except for, of course, use group 4, which is, post office and jail and all the things. No, but I went through them. The one that seemed the most community focused was use group 3. And again, I think what we're trying to avoid, if we're activating a space in a residential area, we want to make sure that it is providing a service, right? Right now, the business trends that we are seeing in the district do not serve the community in the way that they want to be served. It is and we're specifically talking about smoke shops and, the proliferation of.
Understood.
Okay. So the board members here, we feel like that, we want to support number 1 with this condition. We want to allow the activation of these storefronts so long as they serve the community in a specific way. Yes. Okay.
With community approval.
So you want to do both. You want to do with the specific use group and BSA approval.
I'm not sure about PSA approval per se, but I mean, it is possible that when the store goes out of business, that the community is throwing parties because they think it's finally going to turn back to residential in some neighborhoods. It isn't just about the
What are the
business.
mechanisms for community input?
Under that proposal?
No, I know under this proposal, it's as of right. What are our options for community input?
Oh, if you want to propose that?
Yes.
I mean, there's many, so it could be, there's a spectrum, right? ULURP being kind of the highest level or something, but then there's BSA and CPC permits, which are discretionary. If you limited the use group, but didn't add anything else, then it would still be as of right, but you would be limited to those use groups. So you wouldn't get community input per se, specifically on a case-by-case basis. But if you wanted to do that, you would say, okay, only these use groups are allowed. And then I, as a business person, could say, oh, well, I fit into that use group, I'm going to do it.
What is the simplest community input process from BSA to CPC? What is the simplest one?
It's quite frankly a gray area.
Can we add it to like a chair certification or something like that, where it's like a discretionary action in the DCP, but it also requires community input? Is there a mechanism for that?
Right, so certifications are interesting because they're technically ministerial, which means, it's
Just by way of
black and white.
example,
Right,
like, is there something that's
So,
like that?
so if you wanted to do that, that's okay, but the thing is, because they're ministerial, those have specific findings that are not subjective. Those are, you meet it and you're approved, or you don't meet it and you're not approved.
Right.
And so if you'd like to introduce something like that, you
Would
could
we have
propose
to,
that.
or would we have to bring it to like a special permit level to really bring in that subjectivity? Or is there something lesser than a special permit that we could suggest?
It's different. Frankly, it's not really a lesser, some have BSA, a special permit, that's discretionary. A CPC special permit is discretionary, as is the CPC authorization, but they kind of serve slightly different purposes. It's tough to go into all the detail now. I'm happy to get back to you about which is which and like why certain things are here versus others.
But that would be like the menu of options. so to
Yes,
speak,
yes.
That we could,
Where you could say, because it would be difficult to say, we want this to be a certification if it serves the community. Serves the community is in the eyes of the holder.
So the reason why I'm asking this question is that we certainly can, and I think we certainly can limit use groups and we could add the BSA or do one or the other.
What you could do, I mean, we add the worksheet as a guide, but you could also just say discretionary action if you'd like.
With public input, discretionary action.
Discretionary action
With
by
public input.
default, yeah, so.
Oh, okay.
But then you wouldn't need to like go into the details of CPC versus BSA or.
How does that feel? Good.
The groups, I mean, the neighborhood may want something that we've limited at Adam. We don't know what the neighborhood wants.
So I think this allows for,
sounds-
use group 3 would still be as of right, although all other applications would be discretionary and subject to community input.
Okay,
That's perfect.
okay, okay.
And if I could just add one more thing.
Yeah.
So the idea of completely removing the time limit in terms of this is a little troubling in terms of that, just because if the point of this is to go after COVID era closures, maybe we don't need indefinite period, which may open up the door to other prior uses that may have existed previously. I mean, it's 5 years a reasonable number, is 10 years a reasonable number, just so it doesn't get silly, where people.
So the indefinite window is from.
Right over warehousing.
Want to reopen the Miller's studio.
Yeah.
Steve, I don't want to leave you off. I'm trying to move forward. Do you have something you want to add?
The only thing with the community input is, like, if we could say it should be expedited or something. I just, like, if there's a business that
Yeah.
wants to come in, like, I just don't want like some 3-month period where they gotta wait to open because we gotta have like whatever process. So I would just want it to be, as
So-
fast track as possible.
Okay.
I know you want to move on.
No, we really have to move on. We can talk about each one of these things for an hour, so.
And again, you have till the end of the month. I know you want to make all the decisions.
No, we have.
No, we don't, we have our board meeting on Monday.
Oh, okay. Fair.
So time limit, how do we feel about time limit? 5 years, just to prevent warehousing, to prevent maybe perhaps that space goes through another round of zoning text amendments.
Yeah, I don't think we have to be that concerned. I think anyone who owns this property isn't gonna want to see it sitting empty indefinitely. It's costing them money. They're gonna want something to happen. Now, maybe it can't happen in 2 years because these processes take a while sometimes. But they don't want it sitting empty indefinitely. So I don't think we have to be too concerned about this.
Well, I think I'm okay with putting a time limit. Maybe it can be in between 7 years. Because that's plenty of time for anybody to be able to do something with the place or not do something with the place.
We have a
Whatever.
precedent of 10 years for the grandfathered and auto body shops that we provide a zoning variance for every 10 years.
So then maybe 10 years. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with that.
With regards to time limit, 10 years. I'm not seeing any head shapes. Oh, yes, that's fine. Okay, 10 years.
Yeah, no.
If it's about, if it's about number 2,
I'm sorry, I'll be quick. I don't know if there's a way that we could maybe institute a vacancy tax, something like that, for those who are,
yeah, but not for zoning.
That's not under our
Yeah.
jurisdiction.
or suggest that be a thing, because I know that that's often a reason people do sit on empty vacant storefronts.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
interesting.
thank you.
I would suggest less than 5 years. Or less.
Does anybody agree with less than 10 years?
Does anybody agree?
Does anybody like to see this less than 10 years? See this act, to see,
10 years seems kind of long.
okay. 7 years.
That's the number I thought.
Hands, 7 years. Nobody, 5. Three? Because not everybody here is voting. So.
I'm pro 10, that's why.
Yeah.
Yeah,
One thing to consider with the time is that different ownership. So someone could hold it for 7 years, do nothing with it, they sell it, and then the new owner is kind of like, oh crap. I don't actually have anything to do, so I'm less concerned with the timing period, especially if we have some type of community approval process that we talked about earlier, that kind of helps address it. Hypothetically, you could recommend against it, if you're like, well, this has been closed for 15 years. What are you doing trying to open up a dance studio in the middle of the block?
Then we'll just put it to the full board. About the discussion, we didn't come to a resolution on warehousing, so that the timeline's gonna go to the full board. Okay, but we've come to an agreement on, opportunity for community input, which that's discretionary with all your other uses besides use group 3.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to number 2, consolidation. Can you, so my understanding, C1 is local retail, C2 is local services. My concern is the loss of diversity by combining C1 and C2, and we only have some areas by Coney Island Avenue that are C1.
Mhm.
If C1 is local retail and C2 is local services, right?
Mhm.
As they are defined now.
Mhm.
Then if you combine them, now you're allowing a mix in where otherwise there was only service and only retail. Is there a possibility to lose the diversity of the types of businesses?
We haven't found that as an issue in most of the districts that we've looked at. We find that expanding the menu of options doesn't necessarily mean that those who would open in a C1 district now look at C2 and say, oh, we're gonna, open this new business. What we've typically found is that there are specific instances where a person would say, oh, I want to do, again, I go back to bike repair, for instance, and I can't do it in the C1. So we actually have found a lot of, and I would assume there are a lot in the existing C2 districts here that are already permitted in C1 districts. If that makes sense. My
It's just the
understanding,
other way around, that the C1 districts don't permit C2 activities.
But C2
That's
does
not-
permit C1?
Right.
Is that
Sorry.
correct?
Let me go
So-
back to these.
so sorry, C2s, it's the square rectangle problem. C2s allow anything that C1s allow, but C1s, there are certain
allow,
uses that C2s do not allow.
Right, and I'm just worried about the loss of diversity, which is the C1, which is local retail under.
But C2 allows for that.
Right. And I guess I don't want to speak for you, but I think maybe your fear is that, well, if they can all do what C2 allows, then they'll all do C2s, and then the C1s, even though they're technically allowed, won't be utilized. Is that a fear?
Yeah,
That's not something that we found with many of the business owners. Again, I can go into more detail, but there are plenty. I would venture to say the vast majority of businesses that are currently open in C2 districts are already allowed in C2 districts. Which
but we have a C1 district, so now ostensibly it would be a C2 district, so whatever was there, they were retail stores selling, let's say, grocery goods for the, Pakistani community, right? So it's just a retail store, it's just selling spices and rice, and now it's been upgraded to a C2, and now you can put a service in there.
Yes, you can do that. We haven't found that many businesses actually do that. I mean, usually a business owner says, this is my business.
No, when the business vacates, now we.
Oh, if the business
zoning.
vacates.
It's all Tribeca Pediatrics, all of it.
Yeah, so it's all.
Oh, pediatric, that's community facility use, and that's already allowed in both.
Okay.
But
Henry
fair.
Road is just C2, but there's a 99-cent store, no service, it's just selling stuff.
Yeah, because C2, you can do C1, but if half of Cordelia Road was C1 and the other half was C2, then, and under this zoning text amendment, I'm just talking, then everything, those businesses on C2 could operate across the street. So what I'm saying is, I'm just questioning the loss of diversity, like for an area like on Coney Island Avenue. So that was my question.
I mean, in general, I'll just speak from my point of view. Generally, we found that, I mean, the market kind of helps figure a lot of that out. If it's gonna be all the same business along a road, well, you have a lot, as we said, of C2 districts already. Is that?
The C1 district, I think, was just 18th Avenue, and then
And-
2 blocks of Coney, which right now are the Dunkin' Donuts and the homeless shelter.
Right, so I mean, kind of think about it yourselves, right? In the
Right.
C2 areas, do you see a loss of diversity there? Do you see the same business all along? Not really, because these businesses, they serve a market or they don't serve a market.
Right, because they can operate on both fronts. So I'm just asking about loss of diversity. We don't have a lot of C1. We only have a little bit on Coney Island Avenue.
Right.
And when you say market trends define, we know again, we have market trends that are being heavily defined right now.
Okay, and that's all fair. It's not something that we found to be a difficulty, or an issue, but it's all fair.
If I might, but seeing as how this is citywide, we don't have 5 and 6s, so it's not affecting us directly, but how do those pair, like C1s and 2s, how do the 5s and 6s?
Those are significantly different, right? So basically, commercial overlays, those are overlays above a residential
I
district.
know what they are, but you say you want to simplify, you want to combine. Did you say 5 and 6 you want to combine?
That's a totally separate proposal, right? So this is only talking about the overlays, what we're discussing right now. The C5 and 6s, we could talk about that, but that's a completely
It's
different
simplifying,
proposal.
I'm not simplifying, where you're combining. C1 and 2 is going to be combined to C2, but you mentioned some other districts are going to be combined.
They're gonna be simplified. That is not part of this that you're looking at here. We wrote the word simplified district types, that refers to C1s and C2s. Correct, in this
Okay.
proposal.
Okay, thank you.
We could talk about C4s later on.
Okay.
Yes, you
I have a question about it. I was asking before because I wanted to know if maybe anybody had any kind of concerns about the type of businesses in a C2, kind of like your example before, but that might interfere with, an overlay in that particular neighborhood. But also I wanted to ask about the small scale production and whether or not that would fall into a C2. The number 3, would that fall into a C2? And if so, if anybody has any kind of thoughts about anything that would be bad about simplifying the C1 and C2 into a C2.
with regards to the small scale
Scale,
production.
yeah, exactly,
specifically.
exactly.
I thought going in my mind honestly is also about the agriculture.
Yes.
We have storefronts and what would keep someone from not turning and then David mentioned agriculture in terms of food, but I'm thinking weed.
Right,
That someone would want
Yeah.
to just decide.
right.
So,
Or growing weed in one of these places, so that's a thought that I'm having.
Doesn't that come under a, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're gonna,
and that also,
That's separate. The small scale production does not happen at all under C1, and the only thing that's changing on the simplifying is the C1s are now allowed more in C2.
right, so then small
So
scale.
number 3 does not come into play at all on number 2. So we can move on to number 3, I think. We just gotta get a consensus.
Well, so small scale production can occur in C2.
Yeah, and I see your point, right? If you allow the C1s to now allow what C2s allow, they'll allow, if this is, again, this is all contingent, then they'll allow a maker.
There's a lot of Venn diagram in this.
Yeah.
That's true.
So you see where we're getting about diversity. Again, in our district, we don't have a huge, I don't want to take the slide down because we might refer back to it, but I think it's just over at Coney Island Avenue. That's the only space. And it's just a couple of lots.
Well, it's also all of 18th Avenue of our district, I believe.
Isn't it?
Do we want to just put up the slide?
Yeah, I don't want to interfere with you, but there's slides that may require a little bit of jumping around.
Yes, yes, C1 is all of 18th Avenue.
So if we go back, up, forward,
Back, forward. Chow, chow.
back.
This is the beginning.
That's on slide 25.
Right, so if you want to go to the C districts, keep going back. Yep, there you go.
Ta-da.
So C4,
Go back.
more, so these are your C2s, right? And then once more. There you go. So it's right here. Right, Avenue, and then Coney Island, one here, a couple here, and then one that's
That's an oddball.
own district. That's Avenue H, I believe. And I think that's
Oh,
That's-
right.
yeah.
That's 817?
I would assume so.
Yeah.
I would assume so, yeah.
So we see like the combining of the two districts allows the new use groups that are coming in, like small scale production, to operate in an area that was specifically for local retail or had a very specific.
I mean, they're both for local retail, but I.
Well, you can't, can you do small scale production and sell in the same space? I don't think you can. Is it,
Yeah, you know. I mean, under the proposal, yeah.
under the proposal?
Mhm. I mean, that's a lot of what it is, right? It's like,
Baking the donuts, selling the donuts.
yeah, something like that. For instance. Or a small pottery, so you can have something.
So we're talking about two things, but we can start with C1, C2. Any thoughts?
I like it.
Yeah, I like it.
You like it?
I think it's mostly fine, but it does sound like there's gonna have to be a case by case basis review.
It's as of right. Everything's
So-
as of right. So
I
either
mean-
we make limitations or
Right.
we say no, or we say yes.
Sounds, it sounds like you're saying this would be fine as long as the C2 is the traditional C2, not the C2 that it's changing to with the small scale production added.
Right.
And if that's the case, then it seems like what you, again, not putting words in your mouth, it seems like what you're saying is small scale production and as well as things that are allowed now in the C2 should remain the C2 and shouldn't be allowed in the C1. It sounds like you might just be against proposal number 2, which is fair.
No, actually, I think that I'm fine with it. I just can't think of any reason to not be fine with it. It's kind of what it is. I'm mostly fine with it, but I do think that maybe there might be some other things that I'm not seeing in reviewing the rest of the proposal that might work in against the favor of the community
Yeah.
in some kind of way.
Worried about like the unintended consequences.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Melissa.
Yeah, we're gonna-
I'm completely fine with by all means, simplifying district types. What I'm hearing a lot of is that people are uncomfortable with things that come later.
Yeah.
We're
Right.
still only on number 2.
Yeah.
I'd like to point
Well,
out.
that's the,
But
that's,
I'm hearing a lot of different industry types and a lot of euphemisms and kind of hints at other things that are coming later that people seem to be uncomfortable with, that they are wrapping up in these two C1s and 2.
because they changed the use groups, and when you change the zoning and change the use groups, it's a Venn diagram, as she so elegantly put. So then you go back and you're like, well, how do you?
But there's also a lot of other changes that are proposed in here too, which is what I think people are also uncomfortable with, and that's what I'm hearing a lot of.
I'm sorry. You wanna, I had appendix slides that actually delineate the proposals in more detail. Yeah, they're later on. Yeah.
Can I quickly, this is what I was wanting to say at the top. I mean, I want to just talk a little bit as a district manager and, when David did his mea culpa about DCP not being a great regulatory body, it's actually very few agencies in the city right now are great regulatory bodies. It is so difficult. I think I've had zero success in 12 years getting a zoning violation enforced. Except maybe that one cheese factory in a house. But it's just so hard to get noise complaints addressed. It is really hard. DOB shows up twice with a DOB complaint and then closes it, and you have to be really devoted to putting it back in until they can get in and they can enforce. So a lot of these proposals would depend on, I think, Greg, you brought up a great one about, we have big houses, and if those houses then become businesses and there's a limit on the square footage, who's going to enforce that? Pretty much nobody. I mean, that I think that is really what you're kind of alluding to. It's like how to make sure this gets unfolded and enacted as intended. And I'm not usually pessimistic, but this makes me feel a little bit dour about how hard it is to do things.
Understood. I'll open up by just being frank. This is big. I'm not gonna pretend that it's nothing, right? I'm not gonna pretend that that's not the case. I'm also gonna say that because it's big, it's requiring a lot of communication with all of those other agencies as well, because we have the same peers, right? So there's certain situations, right, that you're talking about. For instance, and I don't want to jump all around necessarily, but there's certain situations, right? We say home occupation can only be 49% of your apartment. We're under no assumption people are laying down tape, in their apartments. We know that that's the case. But the goals of those are to make, or that anyone could even go in and regulate, right? The goal of that is to make sure that it's primarily a residential, for instance, right? There are other regulations that we're putting in that are very specific, right? And those are, it either requires a process or there's other regulations added in the case of auto uses, right? Which are a little bit more specific and aren't regulation after the fact, they're regulation before the fact, right? And then there's others that are more specific in other circumstances. And so we're not going to pretend that all the regulation and all the enforcement has been perfect. And yet we're in this place where opening, operating, and being successful as a business person is becoming darn near impossible in a lot of our districts. And so we know that it's been
But we had a huge increase since COVID in
Yeah,
that.
we have to move on, thanks. Oh, sorry, it's really,
we're doing what we can, is what I can say.
we're up to small scale production.
I think we decided to stay on my side.
But not everyone here supports number two. I just want to make sure that.
Oh, sorry, okay,
And-
simplify district types, all those in favor of simplifying district types?
And this, by the way, can clarify, like, these are the kind of things also that aren't allowed in C1s that are currently allowed in C2s. Right, and those have regulations as well, that size sometimes, but that's more specificity.
Those in favor? Those not in favor? That's 5, okay, it carries.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think that people need to realize that there's no possible way that we can really get into these things, because as lovely as this presentation is, he's only giving us the kind of subtle difficulties, not really expounding on any of the worst case possible scenarios. And there will be some, there's always unintended consequences. The hope is that this will do more good than bad. And if you think it's likely to do more good than bad, then you support it. If you think it's most likely going to do more bad than good, then don't support it. But none of these things are going to come out the way he's presenting them.
Right,
All right.
thank you. Moving on to small scale production, so coffee,
Can you go to the next slide? Next
makers,
slide, next slide. There we go.
bakeries, apparel making, jewelry making, non hazardous small scale things.
And there's size limitations for more specificity, 5,000 square feet in C1, C2 districts, 10,000 square feet on the ground floor in C4 through C7.
Any questions?
Now,
What?
what is it now? Could you,
It just not,
it could be anything, so you're limiting it.
It's not
It
permitted.
doesn't exist.
Where
it's not permitted, period, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so, yeah, so basically currently at the top there, right, there's a very, very limited range of production uses, so not, I apologize. But a lot of those are, obsolete from 1961, and they exclude a lot of these that we're looking at here, and they're gonna have, those size regulations. We think it's a good way to make sure you're not gonna have a massive brewery for something in a C1 or C2, because this wouldn't be feasible or permitted. Yeah.
Any questions? Any questions back there in the front?
I just have one question. So the last bullet point there about ABC and right to know environmental standards, and to ensure they are appropriate to locate near residences. How is that analysis done? Is it internally to ECP or? how's that work?
So this is an example of where we find the regulations that's done by other areas, right? So for instance, state liquor authorities, ABC licenses, those will still have the same processes, right? And my understanding is those licenses do come to the community board in certain situations, right? ABC licenses or SLA licenses?
SLA,
Yeah, so like those all maintain, they're just outside of DCP's realm because we are really just talking about, the zoning as a whole. They can say, okay, well, the use is permitted, but we have our own regulations, making sure we do it a certain way. Same thing with any of these, right? I mean, there's regulatory environments for those of you who run businesses for anything from florists to barbershops to anything like that. Those all maintain. Zoning doesn't change any of that.
Anything, any concerns about small scale production? No. No, anybody? All those in favor? Anyone opposed? One opposed. Loading docks, I don't think we have loading docks except for at that M1 on, Avenue M, the old film studio with the film studio.
Also along, McDonald Avenue.
On McDonald Avenue. I don't even know what to say about that.
See,
So are they gonna be? any
About
loading
McDonald
dock
Avenue.
requirements, or completely eliminated?
So the loading dock requirements, basically, if you have them here, right? So this is also in commercial districts too, right? But not commercial overlay. So it would really only be the C4s, which on the applicable building map is, limited to those places. They require a lot of these, where not only industrial districts where you're delivering, the materials or the widgets or whatever to the place, but also where you're receiving them, that's where they have the loading docks. And so it leads to some of these situations like this, even where, as the building changes over time, a lot of times it's just not helpful, right? And so we want to remove the mandate for new tenants in existing buildings in the commercial districts, right, to provide additional loading berths. If there are loading berths already, okay, great,
So if a business that is, let's say, there's a business that's moving into a C4 building and there aren't any loading docks, the delivery of materials and goods in which to operate the business, let's say it's a bowling alley or amusement, I don't know, whatever, there are quite a few things that are allowed, in amusement in C4. They would not require a loading dock to load all of that material off their truck. They would just be lining it up on the sidewalk and walking it.
Now, you're still permitted to have a loading dock.
But
to be
let's
clear,
say the
but-
building doesn't have one and there's an
Right.
amusement going into the building.
Right, then I mean, I can get back to you on the specifics. I would need to look specifically at that, but this is for like existing buildings, really. And so like. And
Like at the
so
shop
new
lighting
construction
expands.
still, so new construction, by the way, to be clear, still will require loading. This is about allowing existing buildings with the docks to access like new tenants that may not need them.
That may not
Need
need them.
additional loading.
Okay,
We're
gotcha.
just concerned that there's gonna be tractor trailers blocking the streets because there's not sufficient loading docks.
Understood.
Kind
Understood.
of like a Target, right?
Yep.
Like they're always out on the street,
Mhm.
going up the sidewalk and
Yep.
they don't have a dock.
Right.
Different zoning for them.
Think about the one on Church.
Any questions, concerns about this? No, we'll just get through it. Anyone opposed? I don't see anyone opposed. Alrighty. Up for commercial. Oh, but can you explain to us the segregation between residential units? So I heard you say two separate entrances, and we're just talking about upper floor commercial. I'm trying to understand how, does it look like a hotel where if they have to share an elevator, the residents have to key in, they cannot share an elevator?
Correct.
Not share an entrance.
Correct.
They can share a floor, so we have two floors.
Yes, they could share a floor, and yet I believe that there would be, here we go. So here we go. So at the bottom here, physical separation will be required between residential and the non-residential portions of the building, right? Usually it's vertical, but if it's horizontal and we have, regulations for noisy uses, they have to have a minimum 15 feet of separation or material or something to attenuate that noise, right? So if there's a residence here and then there's like a non-residential use here, particularly like a noisy one, like a bar or restaurant in particular, you need to have 15 space of nothing, essentially. Which in a lot of the C1 and C2 districts, the buildings don't have that space anyway,
So for security of the residents and then the interaction of the patrons, Because I know a lot of this is predicated on trying to get use of that roof. Your commercial, right now that cannot operate on above the first or second floor cannot access the roof of a residential building to conduct activities, and that's what some of this is driving. So what I want to know is, this building now has to have two cores, right? You have to have one elevator dedicated to the commercial, another elevator dedicated to the residential. They're two separate entrances. And the building is one building with perhaps two addresses, you know what I'm saying? So that's the way it's set up.
Yeah, they'll need to be fully segregated from the entrance with the access, whether it's, and a lot of these would be, and again, this is permitted not only in the larger buildings like this, but in C1 and C2 districts, which many don't have elevators, right? So 3 or 4 story buildings of currently residential over retail, many will remain. But in spaces where it makes sense for businesses to, locate above, they would need to then add a separate door, which would take away from, if you're looking at a C1 or C2, like a 25-foot frontage or 30-foot frontage, you need a separate door, you need separate staircases or something like that. You need separation both vertically and horizontally.
So,
Right.
sorry. No, you got it. No, I understand. You answered my question. My other question is like, okay, so we have this new building on Aurelia Court that just went up and has 2 floors. It's got 2 separate entrances. It's got 2 separate elevators. It's got an escalator to a second floor for commercial. Let's put MIH aside, right? Because they got extra floors and all the things to put in affordable units. But let's just say they want to convert one whole entrance and one whole part of that building to be commercial. Theoretically, they can, right?
Convert a residential unit to a commercial.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so then if, in the case of Aurelia Court, if it was aside from, you see where I'm going with this, if it was aside from affordable housing, if it was just a market rate building with 2 floors, 2 elevators and 2 entrances, industry could come in and take over those units, those residential units as offices. So
In theory, and yeah.
in theory, okay, so I made my point.
Would any of that construction work, so you're saying where you have to split and create an isolated unit to go into this commercial space above where it was residential, that would those renovations would have to go through the local community board, wouldn't it? That kind of construction work and everything?
No, I mean, it would need to go through the Department of Building.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and again, there's different things in C1 and C2 districts, right? So, so like commercial could be on the second floor in any district, and then in only the C4, C5s, and C6s, as you see here, they could be commercial above residential, right? C1s and C2s, you could not have commercial above residential, right?
Right.
Nor could you have them on the same level in C1s or C2s. So if you're looking at a C1, yeah, right. So exactly. And
That shows them on the same level.
what, this?
Yeah, see, once, you just said you can't have it on the same level.
It's showing like half of the second floor.
Sorry. Yeah, so. Yeah, I need to look at that. You're right. That doesn't agree with it. But you couldn't have it above, I guess is what I'll say, right? So there's so like this could be above residential here. That would not be permitted in a C1 or C2. And C3s are just waterfronts.
So the reason they're going up is to get to roof rights as opposed to just taking the whole 3rd floor.
Some of them,
Could be.
Steve.
I guess in isolation, this proposal has some appeal, but I guess from a bigger picture perspective, I'm kind of not understanding why we would want, given the well-known fact that, we have residential, housing shortage and, that, we have way more people than we have space for, why we'd be doing anything that would motivate business owners or entities to turn residential units to commercial right now. If anything, it seems like we've got a glut of office space that, we need to figure out how to make that into residential. So I feel like we're kind of going the wrong way from a big picture perspective here. That's my issue.
Understood. This is designed for more unique situations where residential is maybe just not being filled in certain areas. But your point is understood, and we've heard that concern for sure.
Anyone else? Yeah, I can take two questions and then we'll try to get through this.
I do, this is a suggestion, a potential comment or an idea, but I like the idea of allowing it on the C1s through C3s, because I think, if I'm understanding this correctly, those end up being like a lot of like really small businesses, I don't know, like a nail shop or a hairdresser or something on the second floor. That's like you find in a lot of like commercial strips, and those seem less likely to cause trouble than, I don't know, a huge venture that's trying to have like a top floor club or something. I know that's an exaggeration. It's not actually what I was thinking.
It could be.
Oh.
C4,
okay.
C5, C6.
Maybe, okay.
Good,
Well,
Rich.
Melissa.
I actually think this is a really good thing to have in our area. They do, there are some amazing mixed use projects. We've had some in our Weaver community district and some that are like right outside. Keaton Flats, people remember that? And
Yeah, but
there's like, so if you think about that, like the grocery store, there's way more than just that, like the marketplace, there's a lot of different things there, media, trainings, a lot that goes on the first floor, but then housing above, both affordable and market rate and a lot of other things. But just down the road too, there's Buxton Estates that's going up, which has 328 units of affordable, some is supportive housing. And they have, they're gonna have like a horticultural, gardens, workforce student, just way more than I can even describe to you right now, but it's on the rooftop, it's further up. They need exactly this kind of zoning in order for that to happen. And it's, surprise. But
it sounds like it's happening, right?
that happen in order for buildings of that size and that kind of housing actually built in our district. So I'm in full support of this because I think that's the fact that the big needs since 421A got fixed.
But the garden is happening on the roof.
It's the garden, it's workforce training, it is all kinds of things that, and it's not just on the roof, but it's further up in the building so that the entire community can use the space.
But then it sounds like that's as of right, and it's not, it's.
Well, it didn't need this zoning text amendment to move forward.
Well, it didn't, but it also got a pretty unique go ahead from the state. So that was actually, it came from HCR, so that's how we got to go ahead.
So that, yeah, I mean, that, again, very quickly, that's a lot of the proposals here is, yeah, technically you could figure your way, you could apply for a variance, you could apply for this or that. But as we know, there's regulatory capture there. Only deep-pocketed, people will be able to do that under our current system. And so it leaves a lot of small business owners or building owners kind of out of opportunity.
Well, I don't know. I'm really, I'm sorry, you guys know me, I'm not an NIMBY, but the zoning text amendments got me really down.
Could we just, is there an openness to approving this with just the low residential? So just that C1 through C3? Or am I the only one? Am I?
You have the freedom to.
Yeah, I know. I'm
Yeah,
sorry. That was a question for everybody else.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we could do whatever we want. So if we're not excited about industry on the same floors as residential or above residential, then we should make this a maybe a negative do not agree unless the condition that commercial remain below residential. Because you could.
That's not what this is.
Or
Well,
single use on each floor.
So can we just vote for not supporting or supporting?
You can vote to not support, but say unless commercial remains below residential. So the incentivizing of taking away, you could say roof level, but nobody's gonna do that if you have to put 2 floors and 2 elevators.
I just think in our district, this is so remote. I just speak up a little, please. I just think in our district, this is so remote.
We have a lot of C4 in our district, all of Church Avenue.
But the market now is like, the demand for residential is so strong. Why would somebody do that? I just don't see it, you know? Yeah.
It makes, it goes on.
The money is in, I mean, the money is in market rate. You're gonna tell it's
Just.
not market rate.
The last time they made changes was 1951.
Rally.
So this is likely to be in effect for a long time.
Yes.
So
Absolutely
today's
correct.
exact situation.
I appreciate it. So so the motion on the table is to, disapprove unless, commercial remains below residential. Like it is here with
C13.
C1 to 3. All those in favor? Those opposed? All right, that's the recommendation we'll put forth. Okay, moving on to the next one. But you got me with double laptops tonight, guys. Use terms.
I think that's it. It's just terminology. It doesn't change anything. So that should, right?
Oh, no. Yeah, so this is one of those, again, to be fair, Venn diagram issues, right, where this would impact other things, obviously, but this just changes terminology and brings it into the 21st century region.
Does the combining of those, things change, I guess, the rules of how they're regulated as well, or they're just?
No, not through this proposal. So for instance, like we would through this make definitions that don't exist today, right? Cell phone repair was not a thing that was defined in the zoning code of 1961 for whatever reason. And so we would have, things like that would be introduced, just to make it clear, this is what this business is. But no, any regulations of what's allowed, that would still go back to the ZR, which says, here's your district, you're allowed these use groups, and then, whatever, makes sense from that. Because right now, if you look at the ZR, you say, I'm in an R4 district with a C2 Thor overlay. Okay, you can have use groups, 1, 2, 3, 4A, 6B, 7, something like that. And so we found a lot of business owners don't know what they're looking at. And even if they know the kind of business they are, they're looking at the zoning resolution terms and thinking, what?
So it's 6 gonna have subgroups then? Is that what you're saying?
No, they're all.
No, that's what it is now.
Oh.
So that's what we're trying to rectify.
So it's no change to 1, no change to 2, no change to 3, no change
Well,
to 4.
Well, this is kind of an example.
So then we all
So
have to
it's gonna-
sit down with every use group and try to pick out.
So it's based upon, like you said, kind of that tax code, regulation where people kind of know what they are. And so the reorganization is based upon the impact that we tend to find from these different uses, right? So for instance, we don't tend to find a big difference in the impact on the neighborhood between bike rental and repair or an eating and drinking establishment, in terms of the significant nuisance or something like that. And
I do.
okay.
And
Sure, and that's fine, but again, so we're
We have bikes that come and
so, okay, fair. What?
Amusement, is that under recreation, entertainment, and assembly?
Correct.
Okay, so you see different impact from amusement, and recreation, entertainment than retail and service.
So that's like some of the background of what we're doing. So there's more specificity involved. You're more than welcome to go through the whole list.
I can't describe it to everybody here, and
I
that's
understand.
why I'm a giant NIMBY tonight.
No.
No, I completely understand. I mean, this is. I don't know. I mean, this is kind of just our reorganization based on like the 21st century terms.
Yes.
Yeah, I just have a question. You're basing it off of the external industrial code definitions and their general understanding. Is that the idea here? That we're looking beyond the zoning resolution for these definitions or?
So we took our cue from that.
Okay.
And one of those reasons is because many business owners, they already understand that system,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that simplifies it and makes it easier for an owner to understand, oh, I am allowed here and I'm not allowed there.
Right, does it open the door to like interpretations though, that then jump over to this classification system that's beyond, what has historically been the case in terms of figuring out what, particular use is? Does it fall on DOB to make that determination for like a gray use? I mean, what?
So there's way more, so the gray uses, it's part of the reason why we're doing this, right? It's because a lot of the uses that are prevalent now, and we believe will be prevalent in the future, given the way the economy is moving, are currently completely gray, right? And so in some cases, like I said, we'll be adding definitions to clarify, you are this if you will operate in this way, we already have those for many uses, and we'll introduce some new ones.
But there'll still be some gray.
There will always, I mean, in 10 years, there could be a new business, none of us,
Any thoughts on use terms?
Since it's not actually changing the nature of the business, I don't see this as a problem.
Well, so each use group underneath it has a specific commercial overlay that it can function in, right? So it's that Venn diagram again. You're taking a new use group, right, that has been reorganized based on impact and then placed in a commercial overlay where it may not have been before, right? So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm just saying this is what we're dealing with right now. This is the animal. So you're not only looking at the change in use group, but where it's allowable. So
are you saying that there may be cases where certain businesses are now getting restrictions that they didn't have before, and other businesses are gonna be allowed to do things they didn't do before?
yes,
With these new terms?
yeah,
Is that true?
it's possible.
Well, I think it's overlapping with other things a little bit. Again, this kind of goes back to your point of where they're permitted and where they're not permitted, right? We try, of course, it's a Venn diagram. We're trying our best to put them into, proposals that make some sort of coherent sense. So by simplifying some of these, we hope we make it easier for businesses to understand where they can locate.
Here, I'm not interrupting you. I'm gonna read. Here's use group 6, retails and services under the proposal. These are allowed in C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, C7, C8. You know that we all have everything but C5, C6. These are under this use group. This is the one that uses the night code. Automotive dealers. Now, I don't want to say not everything here is as of right. Some things require things. So automotive dealers has a restriction and it probably has to go through one other process. I'll read the ones that are as of right. Grocery and convenience retailers, especially food retailer, beer, wine, and liquor retailers. Health and personal care retailers. Shoe retailers, jewelry, florists. You see what I'm saying? So the list is pretty, postal service, but probably not not. See if there's anything here. So it's pretty automobile equipment rental. It's I'm on page 3 now of what is included in this use group. So I'm just making the point that they reorganize them in a way that I feel like if I don't look at exactly what is in here, that's where the devil in the details lies. So use groups.
Do we remove it?
But wait, what's wrong with having, let's say, furniture stores or a bike repair shop and a drinking establishment in the same use group? Does anyone actually have a problem with that, or?
And like you said, there are some uses that are in the use group there are some uses in certain use groups that would have additional regulations in certain places.
Drinking bike.
Right, so it's
Guilty.
So I may have misspoke earlier when I was, because I think I might have conflated some things in our minds, my mind included. of saying where, you know, we're grouping them based on like where they're, you know, always make sense next to each other or their impact. That's part of a guideline, yes, but that's not exactly as simple as that, right? This organizes them into actually tables in the zoning resolution, which we had for years. But there are certain things where you'll say, okay, in this district, you know, use group 8 is permitted only with a special permit, you know, or something like that. And that's covered, again, the Venn diagram in the amusements thing, you know what I mean, in certain districts. So it's not, I don't want to conflate this with where they're permitted, to your point prior, but like, this kind of just reorganizes where you can find them in the zoning resolution and kind of brings them to the 21st century in our mind.
All right, use groups, anyone opposed?
Use terms?
Use term.
Sorry,
change.
use terms. I oppose too. Moving on to urban agriculture. So that carried, by the way. Urban agriculture.
Carries that do not support carries.
No, there's only 3 people that did not support it, right?
If you're,
You said who opposed?
Who opposed this? And only 3 people raised their hand. Sorry, was I not clear? Who is in support of use terms? Okay, yeah, so we got the right vote.
Okay, thank you.
Urban agriculture.
Do I bring up my thought from earlier?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, no, I mean, you said it and I wrote it down in my notes.
Oh, okay, cool. I know how to say it again.
You can.
Let's go one more.
Save the world.
No, because I want to keep going. So I don't.
So I think
wait, did we confirm would it actually allow marijuana growth?
if,
Okay. I just wanted to confirm
Yeah,
it.
with state regulations.
With the appropriate
Yeah.
FCM.
It takes it out of the zoning.
Yep.
Right.
Right. Okay, thank you.
so I'm not opposed to cannabis agriculture in, now this isn't only indoor and commercial areas. It is allowed in residential areas, right?
Uh,
So long as it doesn't
With-
get dust and stuff.
with certain regulations, so you're already allowed to have some, right? That's like, there are regulations that allow you to have like plants in your home, right? You can grow tomatoes or something, right?
Not by regulation.
I don't know. What? Yes, in residential areas, yeah. Yes. So it would allow like indoor agriculture in commercial
It
districts.
also allows outdoor agriculture in residential areas, right?
I actually don't believe that's the case.
Unless it's currently allowed outside or in any zoning district.
Yeah, that's
Currently, so yes.
Yeah, outside, yeah, my apologies, outside or in a greenhouse.
Okay, so
In a residential district. Yeah.
So I think the only thing I'm gonna say is that, number one, cannabis is not listed in your night codes, and it should be. There are 3 night codes for cannabis. Now, if you're gonna talk about tobacco manufacturing, you should also have cannabis as part of those use groups, right? Because once you do that, then we can turn around and say, given the trend, right? We want to support this program, right? We like cannabis, but we do not want unlicensed cannabis agriculture. Just like we have unlicensed
You don't want unlicensed?
cannabis agriculture.
Okay, so an unlicensed meaning there's some regulatory body
they-
that's not doing their job.
That
Well,
they
even
just
then,
opened it.
yeah, even then it has to be designated as such. So if you go to the DOB, I'm putting in a greenhouse for cannabis. That has to be recorded because then that'll match up with state licensing as well. But if you don't even acknowledge it within the zoning code, then you're missing that opportunity to create that, connection between everything so that everyone knows what's going on, right? As opposed to relying on another agency to kind of do their job and we'll just kind of, we won't need to have to focus on that. I mean, it seems reasonable that
Right.
that at least it's
I-
included as a subset of urban agriculture so that it's acknowledged as a use that.
Well, the acknowledgement is a different, because we do that now, right? For as of right, commercial businesses that go in, again, kind of going back to that, like, I don't know, bike shop or bike repair or restaurant, like, one can, see a business go out of business that is, I don't know, insert business here and open up I don't know, a flower shop or something. We don't see that. Like, we go to DOB for that.
But you've recognized the bike shop in your table, and you've recognized the furniture store that's taking over the coffee
And
shop.
the DOB will as well.
Right, but you don't have cannabis in your table.
Understood.
Yeah, that's what we're saying.
Okay, yeah, that's all fair.
And now, because we want the ability to say, they should be in specific places, right? Or we want to have the option to vote that they should be in specific places. And especially with indoor agriculture, it's very easy to, close the windows and run your hydroponic, cannabis farm. And now, not only do we need the state to deal with unlicensed retail dispensaries, but we have to now ask them to deal with unlicensed agriculture. And that's something that we don't want to do.
Understood. That's all fair. You're more than welcome to put this in.
How would you state
I
that?
think, yeah, the issue that we find, I think is, sorry, go on.
This was raised when we had the committee meeting about, Glenn had asked about water and the response with this mostly hydroponic, and Chair Brown just also mentioned hydroponic, but the amount of electricity and the amount of energy that it takes to maintain hydroponic, especially if you're expanding for something that looks like that room in your picture, that is a lot of energy. And this seems to sort of be counterintuitive to the COYCN proposal that was just opined upon by this board. So it sort of runs along the same sort of thinking that Mr. Cohen expressed when, why are we competing in this zoning text amendment when we're working so hard to develop a housing by introducing commercial uses in what was residential? This makes me feel like we're